If you are like me and Rebecca, you're probably wondering how the hell HR and creative came to share a stage at the Seattle Interactive Conference. So, funny story.
So it begins like this. I've actually always considered myself to be fairly creative, not big C creative, as I like to say, as many of you are, but little c creative anyway. The problem? I work in HR. This is not the kind of line of work where creativity is generally celebrated. But early on in my career, as I was working in corporate HR, I was rising through the ranks on that corporate ladder, drinking the Kool-Aid for sure. And I was kind of a novelty, to be honest. I was always far more interested in our company's marketing and, magazines like Fast Company. This, by the way, is one of my favorite issues, why we hate HR. I was always far more interested in magazines like this than, the trade industry publications like HR Magazine. This is also one of my favorite editions. So my career progressed. I eventually found myself in a role where creativity actually became a liability for me. So I was working in this role, doing things really differently because I thought, why not? But my peers absolutely disagreed. And it became this struggle. It became this, I couldn't understand why I had to be held to kind of a rigid set of rules and process, and my peers couldn't understand why was I constantly trying to buck the system. And eventually it felt like I was in the upside down. I started to question absolutely everything. And I felt like no one really understood what it was I was trying to accomplish. And it got to the point where it was like my peers were looking at me saying, well, what color is the sky in your world?
So the answer is actually Pantone 2925, in case you were wondering. I've spent my entire career in creative environments, which in a lot of ways is kind of the opposite of Rebecca's world, and in a lot of ways too, very different than what a lot of us have experienced. So back in the day, it was the creative world was kind of always these big egos with paradoxically very thin skin, and you would have you are your ideas, right? So we're defined by our ideas, and so we're constantly in competition with each other. It's kind of the natural way that creative works. So I like to say that once you're in that environment and people are in constant competition, that proper behavior, treating each other with respect, that stuff, it all kind of goes out the window a little bit. And you end up in some pretty interesting environments. Kind of runs the gamut from frenemies, which I realized this morning is a word I had never said before, let alone written, and so it feels a little weird, but I'm working with that. But really where you're kind of like, yes, working together, kind of getting along, but at the same time, you really hope this person isn't that successful because it's at your expense. It creates a really interesting environment. All the way to the flip side, which is kind of full-on cutthroat aggression. So I was telling Rebecca about this one time when I was pretty new in my career still, kind of at a big agency, and we're working on this big pitch. It was a huge deal. We worked long hours, kind of crazy environment. And we kind of got into the room, and the creative director narrowed down the ideas. And this one very senior creative who was always used to being the guy, always had these great ideas, his didn't get chosen. So he did what any self-respecting creative would do at 10:30 in the morning, and he went to a bar, and he got drunk. Then he came back to the office, and he confronted the creative director. And so creatives being kind of the models of professional decorum, the conversation went something like, "Fuck you!" To which the creative director responded, "Fuck you!" And then the senior creative, again, competition, having to one-up him, got a little bit creative. So I came up kind of thinking that this was the normal way of working, right? This is how you do it, right? Really the idea that you kind of had to be a dick to get to great work. If you were in leadership, that was certainly your role. And I had plenty of great examples throughout my career that, yeah, absolutely, that's the way to do it. But the thing for me was that it's not really my style. And I'm not very good at it, and some of you may disagree, but I don't want to hear from you right now. You know, but in a lot of ways, that environment, that competition, that kind of cutthroat nature, it can be really great for the work, but what we started to realize is that it's not at all great for the culture.
They don't have slides like this in HR conferences. So while I've never worked for a truly cutthroat culture like Dennis is describing, I did eventually find myself in this role that was, for me, the complete other end of the spectrum. So I went to work for an organization working in downtown Las Vegas, and our goal, the mission for the company, the founder described it as creating a cross between South by Southwest, TED, and Burning Man. So as you can imagine, this is a really interesting environment for an HR person to be working in. And we were innovative not just in the company's mission, but also in the culture. So when I joined, we were operating with this system of organization called self-management, which essentially means we had close to 200 employees in total, and we had no people managers. So the theory is that you operate yourself around the work, right? That you sort of organize around the work that needs to get done. The reality, as I experienced it, was that it was very difficult to hold people accountable. It was very, very difficult. You're actually not allowed to direct the work of others. And so essentially what we saw was that we would have people who were doing the same work here, right? So we'd have a duplication over on this side, and then on this side we had huge gaps of work that need to be done, and there was actually very little visibility to either of those things happening. So this was the phase of my career where I did ask myself, can culture get a little too creative? So I learned a lot during that environment, as we tend to do in challenging environments. But ultimately for me, what I learned was where there is no structure, there's no accountability, no ability to mentor and guide people. And I work in HR. I've always said the best for the best of us, our goal in HR is to create just enough structure so that people can be freed up to focus on the right things, to focus on creativity, to focus on and not waste your time and energy on the things that we don't need. So ultimately, for me, without structure, some structure, there is no culture.
If any of you are parents, a lot of my peers are of that age now. We've all got kids. Or if you are just thinking about becoming a parent, or if you've ever been parented, then you probably go through your life kind of cataloging all of the things you'll never do when you're a parent, right? And keeping this kind of running list. You see people, you see the kid with the snot all over his face, and you go, oh, never gonna happen when I'm a parent. I'm not gonna let my kid do that. And then later you run around and your kid, and you're like, oh, I can't deal with it now. Yeah, you're just trying to juggle. Creative's a lot like that. Being in the creative industry, I think you kind of go through your career, and throughout you run into things that you don't necessarily understand until you're on the other side of it, all the decisions that have to be made, and when the ECD rolls in and decides, well, let's just take this really safe option just to show the client how much work we did. A couple weeks later, you find yourself having to produce the really safe option. You're like, motherfucker, because that's inevitably how it goes, and you curse the ECD and you add it to your list. So fast forward for me, and I'm realizing all of the mistakes that I'm starting to make as I'm in the role of actually having to make these decisions, totally ignoring my list, doing my best to be a total dick. And at some point, really, you just keep building this list, and then I had this realization that this is a really stupid way to work. Everyone's super tense, people are kind of at each other's throats. You spend more time being a mediator than you actually do a creative director. And then you're starting to wonder, do I like this idea because I like this person? We'll talk about a little bit of diversity later. Do I like this idea because it's very similar to one I would come up with? and maybe it's not going to solve the problem for the clients quite as much as another idea would. All kinds of issues that you suddenly have to be thinking about. But as I did this, I tried my best to sort of change the way of working and change the culture within a couple of organizations that I was in that shall remain nameless, but you can look on my LinkedIn profile. But as that was happening, the business was also changing. Obviously, the speed with which we have to do everything that we do changed dramatically. Everything's so much faster. And even the seating arrangements in most of our offices changed. You know, we went from offices and cubicles, bless you, to being in open seating arrangements, and we're kind of like all right next to each other, and there are no more walls to keep us separated, which, you know, has its pros and cons for sure. And now what we're kind of seeing too is that culture is actually a factor in making decisions where people want to go. I think before it was more focused on the work. Culture didn't really come into it nearly as much. Culture was a ping pong table and a keg. What more do you people need, right? And now all of a sudden it's becoming much more of a factor of like, what is my work environment going to be? How am I going to be treated? How am I going to treat the people that I'm working with? And as that's happening, I'm trying to figure out from my end, like, I want this. I want a different culture. I want a more inclusive, better culture, better working environment. I want people to have fun, but I want them to do good work too, which means that I have to balance being a dick with encouraging this new way of working. So definitely feel like it's possible, but how? You can't force culture.
You can't force culture, but you can take a strategic approach. And before we get too much farther in the talk, we want to make it really clear this is not meant to be a case study. This is not, hey, we have done all these things and we have figured it all out. It's not what this is meant to be. We feel like we are still very much in a learning process, but we want to have an ongoing dialogue. And so that's really what our intent is today. We want to share with you what it is we're learning, and hopefully you can take some of this back to your own companies and your own organizations as well. So when we set out to solve a business problem, we start with a brief, right? And we started to ask ourselves, could we use these same tools and strategies to really tackle challenges with our culture?
I'm super simplifying the creative brief, but basically, the creative brief should answer, who are we talking to? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? And why should they care? Why should the audience give a shit about whatever it is that we're trying to tell them? As we started to work through this process, we kind of realized a culture brief could do the same thing. So could we use the same tools that we use to approach our clients' business problems to start to solve some of our culture problems? And you know, at Rational, we both joined about the same time, and it was about this time actually. Yesterday was my 1-year anniversary at Rational, and last year.
Happy anniversary.
And it's a pretty amazing opportunity, and we've seen such amazing change. And as we started to work through this process, we realized that it is possible. That the thing about the culture brief that's different from the creative brief, I think that you really have to be prepared for, is that the answers that you're going to be looking for are much harder to find. And when you find them, they're often much more difficult to accept. So the first section of the culture brief will be the overview. And really what this should do is provide your creative team, which in this case, if you're going to tackle the thorny culture issue within your organization, it's going to be the people that can help you move your culture. And so that will be your team. You need to provide them with the necessary backstory going into the situation. So for us, that means kind of going back to where Rational started. So Rational Interaction was started by Selena Petosa, who is here today. Appreciate her coming. And it is the fastest growing women-led agency in Washington. Inc. 5000 listed us as one of the fastest growing agencies, and we last year apparently grew at 577%. So that's some serious growth. And Rational is a full service agency. We have more than 230 employees, and we have offices in Seattle, Dublin, and a new office in Taipei to serve one of our clients. So Rational actually started in Selena's living room with one developer. and it just grew from there. But almost from the beginning, one of the things that was a differentiator for Rational, for the agency, and for the people within that agency was this concept called RFAM. And it stemmed quite genuinely from the fact that, Selena told us this story of how when they moved into their Pioneer Square office, which my old office used to be right across from it, they actually, like, the full team was in there setting up the office furniture, and Selena's kids were there too. They were kind of all together, really truly buying into what they were literally building and metaphorically building. And really what developed from that was this sense of loyalty and that kind of challenge that comes with, going up against something all together and really bringing people together. It was exciting, and there was this sense of ownership around what was being built. And we like to say that represented kind of the best of family dynamics. And it was people who weren't afraid to challenge each other, would always support each other, ultimately always have each other's backs. So this concept of RFAM is going to be very central to what we're talking about today. So if you fast forward to 2012, Joseph Debbins joined the business, and it got big, 40 employees by the end of the year. By 2016, Rational had 225 employees and really two distinct businesses. There's the agency side of the business, which is where I work, and then the consulting business, a thriving consulting business, which Rebecca works on both. So by 2016, Rational had become a big agency.
So that kind of growth is really great for a business, but it can also, quite frankly, kill a culture. You can't assume that what works for 12 people is going to work for 200, and certainly not that it will work for 2,000. And so when the business grows without a true focus on what's happening culturally, it led to this. So it was the perfect storm. We saw meteoric growth happening. That coupled with a high stress environment, which I'm sure many of you can relate to, right? And then again, in the early days, especially when you're a small company, bad habits start to form, right? So you have a few bad habits, and then you have new people come in, and they learn those bad habits, and eventually you see the bad habits multiply. And so by the end of 2016, this was an agency that, was used to winning award after award for culture. What emerged was something that was almost unrecognizable. And at the end of that year, we say, morale really did hit an all-time low. That kind of growth taught us culture doesn't scale by itself. So no matter what it means to leadership, no matter what it might have looked like to the people who are there early on, you can't focus on growth and just expect a really amazing culture to grow along with you. So if we go back to the brief then, right? What's our objective? What are we looking to accomplish? So first, this might seem obvious, right? You create the place you want to work. So for us, again, it was all of those great things that Dennis described about RFAM. It was this family atmosphere, this viable business, great culture. We were going to keep growing at this same rate. But through this process, we've also realized that it's not about creating the place we want to work. It's actually about creating the place where the people we need want to work. And as we found out, those can actually be two very different things.
One of the most important, crucial parts of any brief is going to be the audience. Who are you talking to? So actually digging into the audience is going to be a little bit different than you might expect. Like to say that if it's a no-brainer, then there's a really good chance you're getting it wrong. So the first thing you need to know is that everyone is not your audience. That may be kind of a hard pill to swallow. Because if you think about it, you always, coming from a leadership point of view, you always have to think of everyone, the entire team, and why wouldn't you? From an HR perspective, I'm sure that is definitely a factor as well, that you want to be taking care of everyone on your team, thinking about everyone on your team. But if you actually want to fix your culture, then everyone cannot be your target audience. So another common misperception is that you are your target audience. And we want to create culture. I mean, it's natural. We want to create culture that represents us as leaders within a business. you want that to represent you, and you want to feel really good about that, be bought into that, and you want people to buy into it as well. But the reality is that that doesn't work. The culture isn't something that you can make happen. It's something that's going to happen naturally, and so you have to actually remove yourself from that process. If you think you are your target and you think your culture is really good, then there's a distinct possibility that your culture is actually broken and you just don't know it. So, with that in mind, who is your audience? For us, and quite potentially for you as well, we think that the audience is influencers. And what I mean by that is not like the trendiest, coolest people in the agency or your organization. Likewise, not the people with the most Instagram followers. They may be the same people, but not necessarily. And unfortunately, Instagram won't really help in this case. So, your influencers are, for us, we divided them into 3 distinct groups. The first are your early adopters, right? So these are the people who are willing to give it a try. You come in and you say, I think we really need to do this. And they're the people who say, all right, I'm down, let's do it. We have a guy in the office now who is career Navy. So he and I really don't have any experience in common, but he's a really nice guy. And we were talking, and he had talked to some people on the creative team and some other leaders within the organization, and he said, wow, it's like, sounds like you know, your team's really tight, and you guys kind of all just go together, and that's great. And he shared this little story with me. He said, you know, it's like when the old story is that if you walk into a room and you've got a bag of guns and you drop it on the floor and you tell everyone on your team that we got to go rob a bank, and they start picking up guns, then you know you've got a strong team.
HR feels a little differently about that kind of analogy.
You know? I don't think I'm going to get any creatives to pick up guns anytime soon, nor do I ever want that to happen. But the spirit of the idea is right. So the second group is the constructive skeptics. And these are the folks that are going to ask the tough questions, which you need to figure out as you come across these people. Because there are, let's face it, especially in a creative environment, a lot of people who are going to ask tough questions. You need to actually figure out whether they are just super cynical and never going to be on board, or if they're actually trying to make it better, if they're actually, there's a point behind it. Creatives by nature, I think, don't buy in, right? We're generally not cheerleaders. We're not all rah-rah, you know, woo, let's do that. We have to be brought along and kind of brought into the process, and it has to work with our natures, our personalities as well. So it's a fine line, but really figuring out who those people are and whether or not they are going to help you move your culture in the right direction is crucial. The last group we call the boundary pushers. And these are the people that will piss you off. Probably weekly basis, some of them daily, some of them every time I see them. It really kind of varies. But these are the people that they're going to push you out of your comfort zone. They're not going to wait. They're not going to ask. They're going to go do something. And those people are going to eventually, if you can figure out how to work with them, how to not really rein them in, because that's the last thing that you want to do, but guide them and figure out what are the things that they're doing that are actually useful to us, the things that are actually going to help us improve the way we work. Those people are also going to be crucial. So those 3 audiences, we feel like they are so important to actually moving your culture forward, really at the exclusion of everyone else. Those are the people that you need to focus on and you need to nurture if you want to actually make change. So these are also collectively, these people are going to be the ones who will help you get past your bad habits that Rebecca mentioned earlier. So they're the ones who are going to be in the room, and they are going to have to be empowered to say, you know what, we don't do that anymore. With a smile, preferably, but they have to shut down the old bad habits that are keeping you from actually getting to where you want to go.
So we couldn't do an entire talk on culture without talking about something that I think is one of the most important aspects of a culture. This is something, quite frankly, that we are still really working on and at times struggling with. So maybe some of you are seeing the same thing. So we want to talk about a couple of things that we're also seeing and learning when it comes to diversity. So first of all, when you see the kind of rapid growth that we have seen over the past couple of years, you're filling roles. At one point earlier this year, we had well over 100 open roles that we were recruiting for. When you're looking at that kind of rapid growth, you tend to rely very heavily on referrals, right? Well, Dennis, do you know anybody who would be a great fit?
Yep. Yeah, and one of the things that happens when we start doing that too, just from the work point of view, actually is a good point to tag on, is that you start to see, like, I will go and find the people whose work I know and really like and feel very comfortable with. That doesn't necessarily push my work, body of work, my agency's work outside of what we would normally do. We start to end up with kind of perpetuating the bad habits by bringing in people whose work we know really well, and some of them I can almost do their work for them because I know exactly where they're going to go. So we actually can harm the work by not being more diverse as well.
Yeah. So when you're relying heavily on referrals, it's important to be conscious that that is inherently less diverse. We tend to go to the people whose work we know, and those are the people who are a lot like us. So it's something that's really, really important to be conscious of. And related to that, it is also almost necessarily inherently less efficient, right? So again, if I'm going to, so-and-so, I can finish their sentences. Yep, let's absolutely bring that person on board. That is the point. That is not the point of diversity. The point of diversity is to come up with a much better product, a much better design, much better quality overall. That is the point. So again, it's something that we need to be really cautious, even in those times where we're rapidly growing, that we're not looking always just for the quick fix, right? Or the person who can fill the role. We need to be looking and be really, really even more deliberate at that point in time to ensure that we're continuing to create a really diverse workforce. And the last thing, since I'm up on my soapbox, the last thing I want to talk about is, honestly, it's a cop-out to blame it on geography. I don't know how many times I have heard, well, Seattle's just not that diverse, so what are we going to do? Or the talent pool just isn't there, what do we do? It's a complete cop-out, and it's something that we have to be, again, really strategic in how we're going about that. So these are all things that we're really focused on, that we think are really important, and I would say we're not doing great yet.
So the influencers that we talked about earlier, those three groups, what do they need? You as a leader will need to think about what they need from you. So the most obvious place is usually people go to is salary, and that's true in a lot of cases. Particularly in creative, it's not a huge factor, surprisingly enough. It's not just money, it's often the work. So it's the opportunity to work on cool things. That's what motivates us. And to build portfolios, build our reputations, that's a massive draw. And that's why all the best agencies pay people the least, because they're able to bring them in and give them really good work to do, pay them a pittance, they work for 2 years, and then they move on to a new shop. We don't want to do that either. We want people to come and stay and build their careers. But the second factor is that people have to know that they're valued. You have to make them understand that their contributions are vital to what you are doing and what you are trying to build. Too often, I think it's kind of a given. It's sort of assumed that if your work gets picked, then clearly we like you. And I don't think that really flies anymore. We have younger generations that are, we won't get into the M word, but that, are, according to the studies, they need to be constantly told how awesome they are. So I'm totally willing to do that if anyone is out there wanting to come in. Finally, is that people need to be heard. Part of this entire process is that you need to be asking for feedback. You need to be listening. And when people are opening up to you, then you definitely need to hear them. They need to see that what they're telling you is breaking through, or they're going to stop talking to you and just do their thing, probably move on. So you need to actually be listening. So the flip side of the equation is what you need from them, right? So we like to say that culture is a two-way street. and really that the best companies invest in the best people, but the best people invest in their companies too. So the first thing that you need is investment. You need people to be all in. If you are truly going to turn your culture around, then people have to buy into what you're doing. The second point is that they have to be patient. They have to understand that this isn't going to be a flip the switch and we're good to go by next month. Everything's going to be great. It's going to be an ongoing journey, and they have to be down for the journey, and they have to be excited about the journey, invested in the company, invested in the work, invested in the people that they're working with, and willing to go that extra mile. They have to stay with you. And the last thing you need from them is honesty. You need them to start opening up and talking to you. You need to listen. And they need to know that they can instigate tough conversations that are going to be kind of the basis for everything that you're trying to do when you're trying to get to the facts that you need for your culture brief. They need to be having those conversations, sometimes with you. If you're fucking up, they need to tell you, and you need to give them the opportunity to tell you.
So in addition to that, though, it's also important to recognize that not everybody's going to buy in. So what happens when everyone doesn't buy in? We've also learned you have to make it okay to opt out, right? There are different seasons for a business, and we have to make it okay. So there are a couple things here. So the 10-year rule basically says the people who got you through the first 10 years of your company are not the same people who you need to take you through the next 10. And the rate that everything is moving now, I'd argue that's a lot shorter timeline now, right? Let's say even first 5 years. So when you see a company, and this happens regardless of whether it's an agency, a startup, we see this in all types of business. The early days, right, there's only a few people, so everybody functions as a generalist, right? You kind of have your hands in a little bit of everything. Then as the company progresses and grows, you see that shift, and the need is no longer for everyone to be generalists. In fact, quite frankly, that causes a lot of problems, and you shift to becoming more specialists. So we see this, and again, this is a really, really important rule to keep in mind. Sometimes we need to give permission. So sometimes your team, this person on your team may not see themselves as someone who needs to opt out. And it's really important, whether it is, again, a really well-intentioned but maybe misguided sense of loyalty, that can factor in. Again, it can be a lack of self-awareness. There's a lot of different reasons, but sometimes it needs to be okay. You just sit down with a person and you say, it's okay if it's time for you to move on to your next great thing. We want you to go, we celebrate, we thank you for what you've done, and we're happy to be a part of your personal journey, but we're giving you permission. Go and do your next great thing. And the last thing, again, whether it's our decision or that person's to move on, this "you're dead to me" sort of attitude is not a good way to deal with dissent, right? We want to, again, if it's time for that person to move on, we want to part as friends. We want to embrace that and help facilitate moving on. So whether that's making personal connections, giving great references, whatever that is, it is really, really important to focus on, we're starting to refer to it as our alumni network. We really want people to see that Rational, whether it's for a really long period of time or a shorter period of time, that it was a really crucial part of their own journey and their career. What I'm about to say is actually considered really, really blasphemous, at least in my world. Maybe not so much for you, but in the HR world, I'm about to get really, really disruptive. I don't give a shit about Glassdoor. I don't. Trevor, thank you for this slide. It's maybe my favorite ever. Here's the deal. And if my director of talent acquisition were sitting in the room, she'd be having heart palpitations right now. But I want to talk about this for a second, because this has been a really, really crucial part of our journey as well. So everybody's familiar with Glassdoor, right, and how it works? We looked into it, and overall, I would say our ratings are not great. They just aren't. We looked into it. The vast majority of the people who are there are former employees. And even more than that, what they're talking about are things that we've heard in exit interviews. There are things that we're already fully aware we need to address. And ultimately, if it becomes an avenue for them to be able to express frustration about those things, great, it can fulfill that purpose. So there's not a whole lot that I can do directly about those reviews, right? But what did get my attention was that we started to see a couple of current employees going out to Glassdoor saying these things are terrible. We're like, why are they not coming to us? Why are we not having that dialogue? And so what we did was we actually created, it was a super simple Google form. And it allows our employees, we're calling it our own Rational AMA, Ask Me Anything. And our employees can go on and submit anonymous questions or feedback. They come directly to my team. We send them out to whoever needs to answer. And then we post all of the answers, questions and answers on Slack. We try to be brutally honest in our answers. People are asking hard questions. Hey, does everybody get a bonus? Or, things like, hey, how come we see this person is no longer around? What does that mean? How's the business actually doing, right? I mean, they're asking really hard questions. We said no questions are off limits. So what we're finding is that it's giving us a much better avenue for having that real dialogue. The long-term goal is that we wouldn't have to have this anymore, right? That people would just feel comfortable to come and ask us the questions directly and know that there's no fear of reprisal or retribution or retaliation. But we recognize also it was really important for us to accept that we're not there right now and to give our team an anonymous venue for asking some of those questions, knowing that our end goal is still that eventually we don't need this tool, but it has turned into a really, really useful one for us. So we have a limited amount of time, each of us, and quite frankly, I want for myself and my team to be spending it on things that allow us to engage with our current employees.
This is the part of the brief where shit gets real. This is the toughest piece of it right here, is actually figuring out what your truth is. What's the truth of your culture? What is the truth that the people who are part of your culture think it is, not what do you think it is? And this is the hardest thing. It's the most important element to get right. You really have to nail this if you're going to be able to change your culture. So normally on a creative brief, this was something that one of our new strategy directors brought in, is this idea of the truth. And normally, for a client, it's something like, heart-wrenching, like, your UI is unintuitive and poorly designed. Damn. So that's manageable, right? We can handle that. But if you are really listening to the people in your teams and you are hearing what they are saying, whether it's to you or anonymously, then you have a culture problem, there's something going on there, then this shouldn't be pretty. So we started talking to people, kind of gathering this feedback, listening through the AMA, through conversations, and what we started to realize was that there's a lot of honest feedback happening. But a lot of it was, we have had a lot of growth, which means a lot of new people with a lot of new ideas, like me, and coming in and being like, hey, we're all going to do this. We're all going to wear red hats, whatever it is. And people are like, oh, great. We've seen this before. This doesn't work. Everyone stops wearing the red hats after a week. Another new savior, not really working for us. But the biggest and most visceral reaction that we got from people was actually around that concept of RFAM that we talked about earlier. And this is our truth. So this innocent kind of rallying cry that people really bought into turned into, without anyone really knowing it, this symbol of exactly how out of touch leadership had become. So the bigger the business got, the more removed, the bigger the gap between, or perceived gap at least, between leadership and the people on the teams. So if you think about that and then you add in kind of tough financial times, or not even tough, but just kind of the normal roller coaster of agency financial life, the bad habits that we talked about before, and then you bring in, honestly, some not great hires, maybe you end up with the fact that RFAM no longer rings true for the majority of the people within your organization. The perception was that it only really applies to a small group of people who were here from the start.
So what do we do with this cultural bombshell? Well, we turn it into an insight, right? So we knew our truth was that RFAM had taken on a meaning that was never intended, but it became iconic in a really bad way. This was particularly difficult. This was hard for us to recognize. So what have we learned? Or another insight is that what we think is obvious are leaders may be creating and thinking they're creating one thing. The team is actually experiencing something entirely different. And that requires really deliberate action. So, how do we act on this insight? Well, first and foremost, we retired our FAM. This was really hard, but we retired it. We said it holds a really important place for us in history, but it's no longer part of our future. We realized if you can't force culture, you certainly can't force family. Transparency. So we are opening the books, both literally and figuratively. So in addition to AMA, we're doing stand-up meetings on a regular basis where we're sharing full force what is going on with the business, how are things happening, how are things doing, with real talk. And our dialogue and interaction. So again, we really are trying to foster an environment where no question is off limits. We can have uncomfortable conversations, no more avoidance. We're dealing with them now.
How do you know you're on the right path? Reasons to believe, pretty common language for a brief. So for us, why we believe we'll succeed is because we have our skeptics. We have our constructive skeptics. They're not going to buy in, and we don't want them to buy in. Sorry, we do want them to buy in. What we don't want them to do is drink the Kool-Aid, right? We don't want them to just be in because and they're all along with us. We need them to keep that skeptical part of their nature intact and keep questioning us. They have to own their part in making our culture better. The second is that we're already doing the hard work. We're seeing it not just on the leadership side, which we are for sure. We're having plenty of very constructive conversations on the leadership side, but then also on the teams, we're seeing that people aren't waiting for us to solve this anymore. They're actually taking their ownership of their part of it, and they're solving it themselves. And finally, the conversation is starting to change. And we're shifting from kind of just general bitching, honestly, to solutions and ideas. People are, instead of just complaining, they're actually coming up with things that we can do. Hey, instead of that, why don't we do this? And we're listening, and to us, that's an indication that people are starting to care again, which is a huge factor.
So how do we know these changes we're making? We're actually looking for some slightly unusual indications that we're actually being successful. Heroes, right? We think that sounds great. When we join the company, Dennis would say, we've got heroes everywhere. That's great, right? Actually, it's not. Right? So we define heroes, and listen, this may sound familiar to you. Someone who's a martyr, right? Who inadvertently throws their team under the bus. Someone who works the long hours because they have to fix everything, right? We are saying we want to see fewer heroes. Our indications will be someone, especially at the leadership level, will walk into a room and say, I'm not needed here, right? Because they trust the team to do the job. So we're looking for fewer heroes. We also want to build careers. So I mentioned earlier this alumni network. We really want to build that out. We want this to be a great launch pad for people's careers. And ultimately, one of the best indicators is that we see things cropping up, people deciding to gather together to do impromptu celebrations, not just of birthdays and things like that, though those are important. But again, these are signs that we're seeing more of the adopters, right? People sticking their neck out saying, hey, let's get together and do things as a team.
So timing. Normally, in a briefing, this would be the part where I would start scowling, rolling my eyes, sighing a lot. The reality is that with creative work in particular, there's never enough time. It's just always going to be the case, no matter how much time we get. But with culture, there has to be enough time. You have to build in time to actually make this work. The truth of it is that it's going to be this kind of ongoing, roller coastering, never-ending, in perpetuity process. You're never actually going to land it. And that, I think, is a key indicator of whether or not you can move your culture. If your organization is willing to invest in something that is never going to be solved, never going to end, if they're willing to go there with you, then you will succeed. So, with that in mind, though, a few key milestones that you can expect to hit as you get into the process. The first is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's just the truth. As you start to change, anything new, anything different, it's going to be challenging. People are going to have to adapt to whatever the new way is, and it's going to make it harder. You're also going to have some of the people, the 10-year people, some people that just aren't going to buy into the new system that are going to have to opt out, or you might have to opt them out, and that's going to make it hard too. I mean, that's definitely going to have an effect on morale, and that's where you really need your influencers to still be coming together. The good news is that it does get better, and we've actually seen this in our time here. We've definitely seen we went through a really tough patch, and then it was great. We started to actually see, oh, this is really starting to work. This is pretty cool. We could get used to this, but you shouldn't get used to it, because the other truth is that it's going to get worse again. But the good news, the silver lining here, is that worse will actually be better than worse before. So there's something to look forward to right there.
And it's another reason to ignore Glassdoor. So while we can't claim that we have this all solved, we are confident that this approach is going to work. It's forcing us to ask really tough questions, to get head on, confront things head on, and have a single focus. So while there's no magic formula, we do have some final steps as you think about creating your own cultural brief. So the first is, again, define your audience. Who are your influencers, your early adopters, those constructive skeptics? Invite them to be part of the process.
And the second is determine your truth. This is where you need to get all Oprah with your team and really figure out what the truth is that you really don't want to acknowledge. Like I said before, it should be difficult.
And last, don't wait. Start now and start with where your team is now. Meet them where they are and get started. There's a Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now.
Thank you.
Thank you.